at 8 o'clock. Donald Trump has been booked by a court in Miami where he's becoming the first ever former US president to face federal criminal charges. A convoy of black SUVs has been greeted by supporters this evening, holding signs saying witch hunt and Trump 2024. Presenter of the Newsagent's podcast, John Sopel, is in Miami for LBC.
These are really grave charges. What was kind of in New York, which was over the payment of a porn star, this is altogether more serious. And so you could have in 2 years' time Donald Trump, next president of the United States of America, or Donald Trump, an inmate in a federal prison behind bars.
Well, Donald Trump denies unlawfully taking national security documents to his home in Florida and has vowed to continue his campaign for a second term in the White House. Alex Soto is a former federal prosecutor in the Southern District of Florida and says this evening's court hearing will be swift.
It's an in and out. He'll be advised of the charges against him, the maximum penalties, and he will plead not guilty and ask for the entry of the standing discovery order in order to receive the documents that the government needs to produce to him in order for him to defend himself. That's the procedure, and that's all that's necessary.
In other news, a vigil's being held this evening after two 19-year-olds and a man in his 50s were killed during an attack in Nottingham. The students were found stabbed to death on Ilkeston Road at about 4 o'clock this morning. Chief Constable of Nottinghamshire Police, Kate Maynell, says the other man's body was found in the city centre.
A man in his 50s was also found dead from knife injuries in Magdala Road by a member of the public. At the moment, we believe that the suspect has stolen this man's vehicle and driven it to Milton Street, where he is then driven at members of the public.
While 3 people were injured in that attack, a 31-year-old man remains in police custody after being arrested on suspicion of murder. In the last hour, Boris Johnson has urged the Privileges Committee to publish its report on whether he lied to Parliament over partygate. In a statement, he says, "Let the world judge their nonsense." And Downing Street says there are no plans to update England's abortion laws after a woman was jailed under legislation going back to the 1860s. Carla Foster was sentenced to 28 months for using termination pills after the legal limit of 24 weeks. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed up 24 points at 75.94 and the pound buys $1.26 and €1.16. LBC weather, showers passing to leave a largely dry night for most of us with a low of 10 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Tim Daly.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. This is Cross Question.
Good evening, I'm Ali Miraj, and you're listening to, or watching even, Cross Question. This evening I'm joined by a really interesting panel. To my left, I have George Parker, political editor of the Financial Times. Also on my left, my near left, I have Tony Devenish, Conservative London Assembly member. To my right, I have the Labour MP Carolyn Harris, who is also chair of the UK Menopause Taskforce. And on the far right, but not politically, is the author and broadcaster Gavin Esler. Now, lots to discuss this evening. You might want to ask our panel about those comments that we were discussing in the last hour about Nadine Dorries, about this being a classless society and her being stopped by getting into the House of Lords by posh boys. You might want to also ask about this issue going on about abortion laws and whether they should be reformed. The COVID inquiry started today, and there was a discussion about whether Brexit held up COVID inquiry preparedness, and also Donald Trump. We just heard from Simon Marks on what's happening there, or anything else on your mind. You can ask our panel this evening. Get your calls in 0345 6060 973, text on 84850, and remember, you can watch us all through the evening on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question. Watch on Global Player. This is LBC.
So let's go to our first question, which is from Robbie in Chelmsford. Good evening, Robbie. What would you like to ask?
Good evening, all. My question is, what is there for the electorate to be hopeful for?
Well, what a question, a philosophical one to start with. Let's start with George Parker.
Wow. Well, I was on a trip last week to Washington with the Prime Minister, and on this trip, the Prime Minister comes back down the plane, and we have a little huddle with the Prime Minister, and I asked him about about why Britain thought it could lead the debate on artificial intelligence in the world when we were a medium-sized country. And he said, typical, medium-sized country, you're talking the country down and all this sort of thing. Yeah. So I'm not going to talk the country down. I think there are lots of reasons to be hopeful in the country. We're facing tough times at the moment, obviously, with the cost of living crisis. The political system seems a complete mess. Brexit hasn't worked out as people thought it might, or at least Brexiteers thought it might. However, look, you've got to look on the bright side. The country has lots of strengths. It's got advanced manufacturing. It's got cultural glories. It's got Premier League football. And all the kinds of things that we should be good at in the future, we are good at. We've made life a bit more difficult for ourselves because of Brexit. I would say that because I work for the Financial Times. But, it's a great country with great cities, a great countryside as well. So, and I see today, by the way, more people are staying at home for their holidays as well. So getting people voting with their feet. So let's look on the bright side.
Well, as someone who grew up in Devon, you would say that that we should, and very nice too. Carolyn Harris, what do you think?
A general election.
What a surprise.
She's on message.
It's only 8:06 and you got to the general election already.
General election, without a shadow of a doubt. I think the country really needs a reset. We have one every Monday morning from the Tory party. Let's have a real one. Let's have one that really matters and makes a difference. Let's have a general election and get a government in, i.e. a Labour Party with Keir Starmer as the Prime Minister, who's interested in addressing the problems of the nation, looking after the people we need to be worrying about and not pandering to the ego of backbenchers who are desperately trying to claw onto their seats in a climate where very few people believe anything they say anymore.
Do you actually think that is the only thing for British voters to be hopeful about, is the fact that there should be a general election now?
Yeah. I think at the moment, I genuinely believe that, because at this moment in time, I mean, I listen, obviously I hear from constituents, but I hear from people from right across the country on different issues, which I'm seen to be someone who is taking a lead in. And everyone, even people who voted Tory all their life, even people who I know who wouldn't contemplate voting anything other than Tory, are exhausted, they're frustrated, and they're angry, and they are ready for a general election.
And you find that palpably on the doorstep, do you?
Oh, everywhere.
What a surprise. Tony.
Well, everybody's on message tonight, and I'm going to be on message too. The reality is I have the honour of representing on the Greater London Authority, Westminster, Kensington, Chelsea and Hammersmith and Fulham. And one of the things I do regularly is go to a Westminster City Council citizen show at me. Mm-hmm. And we have people from all over the world. In fact, two of my best friends from France, actually, post-Brexit, they weren't keen on Brexit either, but they've got their British passports now. I meet people all the time in culture, in business, that say, actually, this is still a fantastic country. Of course we've got problems, but so is every other country got problems. But I think under Rishi Sunak, and he is the best Prime Minister we've had out. Yes, there has been 5, but he is the best Prime Minister we've had. I like Rishi a lot. He has the right values. He's a sensible guy, and he's done a great job in, 7 months. So, we can all be doom and gloom. Keir Starmer would not be a good alternative. What does he actually believe in? Let's face it, he dumped his green policies only last week, and 28 billion pounds. He's got no policies, and of course he voted twice, or tried to vote twice, to get Jeremy Corbyn into number 10. So it's not all doom and gloom. Of course there are issues, but I am positive.
But Tony, to be fair, there are issues, many of which have been caused by the Tory party's own complete shenanigans going on, this pantomime. So even if it's not pantomime season, but it still seems to continue day in, day out. People are tired, aren't they? I mean, Carolyn's got a point.
I think people are tired in the Westminster Village, but I knocked on doors all over the home counties in the elections just now. And yes, people said to us on the doorstep, we're not going to vote for you this time, but we'll give Rishi and I a look in 12 months. It's all to play for. And one thing I do agree with Keir Starmer, he knows he hasn't won yet.
Well, Conservative Party HQ will be very pleased with you for running up and down the country knocking on doors. Gavin, I suspect that you're going to take a slightly different view.
I'm going to take a different view. And I'm not part of the Westminster Village. I live in Kent. I see the queues at Dover. I see the people who are angry because they can't get out of this country or back into this country the way they used to. They don't get waved through the way they used to. I'm Scottish, and I've got roots in Ulster. You go and ask people in Northern Ireland and Scotland whether they think things are on the right track. I think I'll take away the swear words. They would not be very, very, very happy with this. I am, however, an optimist. I actually agree with George. I think this country is better than this. And I've just sent this week a new book to the publisher called Britain is Better Than This. So there's a good plug. We're all
well done.
We're all.
I was going to try and get you to plug your last book, and you've got another one.
I'm going to plug the next one. Britain is better than this. I can give you a host of reasons why the country is better than this. Just one example, which is the University of Cambridge has got more Nobel Prize winners attached to it than any other country in the world except the United States. We're a bright country. We like to solve problems rather than create them. The problem has been that in the past decade or more, because of internal fighting within your party, because of the psychodrama, which we're all utterly bored about, the Conservative Party has failed and needs a long time in opposition to get its act together, because we need a party of the right just as we need a party of the left. But this Conservative Party is a series of failures. And not only is it a series of failures, it doesn't face up to them. And you can't solve problems unless you look them in the eye and say, this is a problem. We shouldn't have had a leader who, for 20 years, those of us who are journalists, knew you couldn't read his copy without going, that's very entertaining, but it's lies. And so the idea that he's finally fallen and a few people in your party are still sticking with them, despite the damage it does to your own party, I think is very, very sad. We are much better than this. There's better people in the Conservative Party. There's better people you've kicked out of the Conservative Party. And there's certainly better people in the Labour Party who, perhaps if they have a few years in government, give you a time to sort out your psychodrama.
Tony?
I think Rishi Sunak is the future as well as the present. I'm not going to pretend last year was the best year for my party ever. It clearly wasn't. I got a lot of flack on the doorstep in the last 15 months before Rishi came in. I accept that. Rishi's listened to. It's a work in progress. He's only been in for 7 months, but I believe our party is united. He's a really great Prime Minister.
Your party
Jeremy, we are united. You can take every party has one or two people, and 3 of them left over the weekend, obviously, including the most famous. The reality is we are a united party. Keir Starmer's Labour Party, frankly, hasn't got any policies or any unity.
Tony, sorry to just... this might come up later, so I don't want to steal the thunder.
Yes.
But you talk about united. Apparently, I've just been handed a thing saying Paul Scully, who was trying to become a mayoral candidate for the Tories, is planning to launch a defamation suit against Samuel Kasumu after Kasumu accused Scully of scuppering his chances to clinch a Conservative nomination.
Look, nobody, even your viewers, the greatest respect to those 2 individuals who I respect, know who they are. Neither of those individuals run the British government. Paul is a Minister of State. Samuel isn't elected to anything. The reality is I'll let them have their spat. I hope it doesn't come to libel. They're both great individuals. But we're talking about the UK government. And Rishi Sunak is doing a good job, and he will continue to do a good job. He's not perfect. He knows that, and he's working hard. And we don't want Starmer, believe me.
OK, well, that was a nice sparky one to get us started, wasn't it? Let's go to our next caller, which is Ranjit in Albury. Ranjit, good evening. What would you like to ask?
Good evening. Is Boris Johnson calling the British government's bluff? What does he know that they're trying to hide?
What does he know that they're trying to potentially hide? Carolyn?
Well, it's probably the bodies that Boris buried. That he knows where they are, and he knows that they know where they are, and that's the problem. I mean, unmitigated disaster doesn't even begin to cover Boris Johnson. And I really admire Tony's enthusiasm for the party line, but nobody with any semblance of sanity can believe that Boris Johnson was a good thing for this country, and not just for this country but for his own party. He put himself first. He's not interested in the country, and he's certainly not interested in the Conservative Party.
Well, this interesting point you make, George. Just in the last hour, the PM has actually urged the Privileges Committee to get on and publish its report, basically saying that he called it their nonsense. Actually,
this is the former Prime Minister, not the current one.
Sorry, forgive me, it's difficult to keep up. But the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson is calling it nonsense. So he's in a pretty rumbustious mood. He's not backing down. What do you make of this?
Well, I think he's throwing out a lot of chaff. I'm not sure how many people around this table are going to defend Boris Johnson tonight, and I don't think they should really waste their breath doing so, because we've had a lot of stuff over the last week about WhatsApp messages and honours lists and cover-ups, and the fact of the matter is that in the next 48 hours or so, the Privileges Committee are going to produce a report. It's a cross-party committee with a Conservative majority on it, which will leave the former Prime Minister's reputation in tatters. He'll be condemned for basically misleading the House of Commons, If he hadn't resigned as an MP, he would have been suspended from the House of Commons and been forced to face a by-election, which he would have almost certainly lost. It's a moment of disgrace for Boris Johnson, or it will be, when we see this report, and people who are close to the committee say it's absolutely damning. And that's a big moment for the life and democracy of our country, when you have a committee made up of his peers in the House of Commons with a Conservative majority looking at all the evidence meticulously over a matter of months and concluding that he lied to the House of Commons. Not just that he lied to the House of Commons, he lied to the House of Commons about breaking his own COVID rules that the rest of the country were adhering to.
George, what do you make of people like Jake Berry and Jacob Rees-Mogg, who basically are implying that he was stitched up because of Brexit and because of the blob being resistant to his plans? And even Boris Johnson himself has said that this is all a big plot to undermine Brexit.
Well, that's Trumpian tactics, isn't it? You blame everyone else. You don't take responsibility for your own actions. And you see it repeatedly from, I regret to say, people in the government. And Gavin might draw parallels with the Brexit episode, where it's always everyone else's fault. It's the media, it's the BBC, it's the Bank of England, it's the Treasury, it's the Financial Times, it's people who live in North London townhouses, people with podcasts. The list goes on and on. There's always a conspiracy. Take responsibility for your own actions.
I just want to say I don't have a podcast yet.
Why not? Go on, Ali, go for it.
Everyone else has. Key performance indicator, Gavin.
What's undermined Brexit is Brexit. We know what it's like now, and it's a mess, and it was badly thought out, and it was sold on a false premise. We know that. And the other part of this is the people who've been undermined. Do you remember a member of the government saying we've had enough of experts?
Yeah.
You remember
that was Michael Gove.
That was Michael Gove. Well, that's very interesting, because we've certainly had enough of amateurs. I mean, if you ask yourself, just to take one of many names at random, how do you become Chris Grayling? You're a serial failure as a minister, and you get
that's
promoted.
an interesting point.
How do you do that? You don't do that in other fields of human endeavour. How do you become Boris Johnson and get to the top, despite the fact people know you're lying? And at the same time, and this is why I'm an optimist, there are so many good people, many of whom have been sidelined because they're experts within government. Alex Allen, Lord Geit, Kim Darroch, Tom Scholar, Sue Gray to a certain extent, and others. And Anthony Seldon's new book, and he's studied more than 50 prime ministers, talks in very detailed form about how this government didn't listen to people who said, if you drop a pen, gravity exists, it doesn't fly up there.
But Gavin, do you think that Johnson's calling the government's bluff on this report, or do you think it's going to be damning, as George does?
I don't think the government has a bluff on this report. I think this report is so damning that I think Johnson's finished, but who knows? I mean, we've got an American president who said he could shoot somebody in Fifth Avenue and get away with it, so maybe Johnson is taking a bit out of that book.
Tony?
Look, it's interesting that Gavin mentioned two people that aren't in the government. One hasn't been in the government for a long time, Mr. Grayling. Boris obviously hasn't been in government for a lesser period of time.
But
the government now, nobody, even people on the doorstep that wouldn't vote for us in May local elections, they all acknowledge that Rishi is a fresh broom, and they will listen again. We've got probably, I think we can all agree, 15, 16 months before a likely general election, and I'm very happy the case will be made between Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak.
Do you think it's the end of Boris Johnson?
I never predict the end of anybody in life. What do you mean by the end? I mean, Boris is somebody...
The political end. Formalised.
I'm not going to... I mean, I know all these individuals well. I'm not going to predict what happens in the future. Only fools do that, or journalists. I can't do that. I'm elected. What I'm interested in is what this party is doing in government, and I think it's doing a good job. Of course, things haven't always gone right, particularly last year. I was on the doorstep at the by-elections. We lost. And I know that better than most people. And I get the post bag like MPs do, and GLA members, we get the post bag. But I was on the doorstep again in London only today. And people that weren't happy with the previous Prime Minister and the one before that were very happy this morning.
Well, but you do know that you get out and about, Tony. That's what we've learned so far. So that's good. That's good. Now, some breaking news just in, which is a huge surprise. Donald Trump has pleaded not guilty to federal charges against him, which relate to the handling of classified documents. More of your questions to the panel coming up next. This is Cross Question on LBC. It's 8:20.
LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question. Tweet at LBC.
You're listening to Cross Question. It's 8:22 on LBC. And our next question is a text question from Chris in Chiswick. Is Labour's target to be the best performing G7 economic nation possible, while at the same time being outside the EU single market? Moreover, is it disingenuous for Labour to say so? Well, I've got to start with you, Carolyn.
Why did I know that was going to happen? Well, no, because, I mean, we're not saying things that we don't intend to do. I think that's the first thing that people need to recognise about Keir, is that he's ready. He's not going to commit to something that he's not prepared to put everything behind. And we do need to be in that position, because currently there's so much poverty in the world. It's not just in the country. It's not just the reality of poverty. It's the thought and the fear of poverty, and that is driving a lot of people into great mental health issues. So,
but Carolyn, Keir Starmer can say anything. I mean, it's like an aspiration.
He does.
Well, no, he doesn't say anything that he's not prepared. He's going to put his money where his mouth is.
But how can he, though? Because it's one of those things. It's like an aspirational target, isn't it?
But we've got to have aspiration as well.
True.
You know, and we're talking about how great this country is. Listen to Keir's message. He is ready, he's willing, and he will make sure that it's funded, costed, and everything will be there.
But do you think it can be done outside the EU? I mean, just give you a bit of context around this. The former Bank of England Governor, Mervyn King, who backed Brexit, earlier told Tonight with Andrew Marr, my colleague, a little bit earlier, that Brexit has been handled shambolically ever since the vote to leave in 2016. Meanwhile, the COVID inquiry was told today that planning for the no-deal Brexit at the end of 2019 greatly hampered pandemic preparation. So is he being disingenuous by saying he can do this by not going back into the EU?
Well, we can't go back into the EU. I mean, as much as I would like to go back into the EU, and I'm sure Gavin would, we can't go back into the EU. I don't think the EU would want us anymore. But
Michel Barnier was being a bit flexible.
Well, I mean, you can't go. If we could turn the clock back, we shouldn't have had the vote in the first place. But we did, and we are where we are. But we're in a position now that we are outside the EU, but we have to make our relationship with the EU work. If we are going to thrive, and if we are going to be the country that we can be and we should be, we have to make our relationship with the EU more productive and more financially viable.
Okay, very powerfully said. Tony, what do you make of what Carolyn's saying?
I'm a policy nerd. I can't remember a thing that Keir Starmer's ever stuck to on anything. You know, this is the man who wanted Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister not once, but twice. You know, what does Keir believe in apart from wanting to be Prime Minister? And all the polling is showing that nobody really knows what Keir Starmer believes in. Whatever you say about my party, they know what they believe in. And the reality is your party hasn't got any policies. It U-turned, as I said already, last week on the Green New Deal or whatever you called it this week. You haven't got a policy on anything. And the reality is Keir has to come up with some policies, because at the end of the day, I believe, and talking to lots of your own members as well, they don't know what you believe in.
Well, I'll take the reputation of being a principled man, which Keir is, with the ability to deliver far more than I will take being involved with the shambolic excuse, which is currently the government.
You mean Jeremy Corbyn?
Well, Jeremy Corbyn was the leader at the time. Please accept the fact we've moved on. We are a different party.
Well,
I was an MP under Jeremy Corbyn. It doesn't mean to say I sang his praises. He was the leader. It is. I mean, you had to support Boris, and please don't tell me you think he was a good thing. We have to support the person who is elected. And it happened to be Jeremy Corbyn, but we are a very, very, very different party, and everybody ignores that. And there's nobody rolls their eyes more in the House of Commons than the Tory MPs. Believe you me.
Well, George Parker's looking distinctly unimpressed by all of this. Is Labour's target to be the best performing nation in the G7? Is it feasible?
It's a good target to have. I don't think being outside the European Union makes it impossible to achieve that target, but a lot of things have got to go right, and you've got to make some very good decisions. I think where Gavin and I are probably about to agree is that you certainly make life more difficult if you're outside the European Union. And just anecdotally, I was having a chat with my brother over the weekend, and he started a business. He invented something at university, set up a company, grew to 100 people, sold it to Shell, started another company, and basically makes high-tech instruments.
Oh, Rishi Sunak must love him.
Well, you'd think so, except for the fact Rishi Sunak supported Brexit. And now my brother's had to open a subsidiary in the Netherlands. Right. His stuff gets stuck in warehouses. Yeah. He's having to pay thousands of pounds to re-register for safety certificates, stuff which was already registered at the EU. This is a classic SME British company whose life has been made more difficult by the fact we're outside the European Union. Governments are meant to be there to help people like my brother, not to make life more difficult. So I'm not going to say that Brexit makes all this impossible, these grand visions of Keir Starmer impossible. It would be, factually, I think, easier if you're part of the world's biggest single market. We're operating in a world of blocks now, China, America, Europe. And we are outside of that. We've made life more difficult. And I can see why Keir Starmer's doing it. I don't think the public have a mood to talk about going back into the single market or the EU at the moment. And he needs to win back seats in areas which was like his lead.
He's got his 5 missions. He's got to put a bit more meat on the bones as the election comes.
My guess is that what you'll see if Labour win the election is that they will gradually start to sort of move closer to the European Union, short of going back into the EU. Because most people don't care about the detail. People also recognise that Brexit hasn't worked. And you mentioned Mervyn King, the former governor of the Bank of England. I mean, basically, people like him are now saying the old thing about, communism's great, it's just never been tried.
Exactly.
It's exactly the same with Brexit. Who would have thought that all the grand visions that came with Brexit wouldn't materialise when ordinary human beings and politicians...
Well, even Nigel Farage is saying it's a failure. Yeah. Gavin, what do you make of Keir Starmer's pledge?
Well, there's a couple of points. One is about simply the idea that Conservatives know what they believe in. I talk to a lot of Conservatives who seem to loathe each other. I mean, I'm not quite sure what your party believes in because they don't seem to believe in each other. In terms of Keir Starmer, I agree broadly. It's very, very difficult to see a Labour Party leader now saying, I'm going to go back into the EU, partly because they would not have us on the terms that we had. We had such good terms relative to other people. And but does it make it difficult? Absolutely. And just look at one case that just strikes me is that in 1973, 2 countries joined the EU. One was the Republic of Ireland and one was us. They had it roughly, and GDP is not the only measure, but 2/3 of our GDP. Now, their GDP per capita is higher than that of the United Kingdom. They've done very well out of it. So it makes Keir Starmer's pledge very difficult, but it's not impossible. It's not an impossible target. But everything about being outside the EU, including I know somebody who's a wine importer who said, I've had to employ 1 extra person just to do the paperwork. I know people in Dover who tear their hair out because they don't know how much they're going to be paying for truckers who sit there because of extra paperwork. And if Starmer, was able to ameliorate some of that, day trippers coming to Canterbury, where I spend a lot of time, they used to come across to France scoop trips on the day, minimum bureaucracy, spend money in the shops and go back home. They don't do
funny, none of the panel have actually said what Starmer is going to do. There's no detail, and that's what that comes across in all the polling.
Well, I don't speak for Keir Starmer, but it seems to me he's the leader of the opposition, and we have got a government which doesn't seem to me to have any particular purpose except to hang on till October next year. So it's up to Keir Starmer to put some more meat on the bones. But the question we were being asked is, will it be more difficult for him outside the EU? To which the answer is yes, but it won't be impossible.
You know, you did actually, Gavin, in your answer just there, you were talking about your friend pulling their hair out, which I thought was a little bit not very inclusive to me. It's all about inclusivity these days. I mean, if anyone's watching on Global Player, you know that I'm follically challenged. So please, Gavin, note to self.
There's hair at the back.
Yeah, always be grateful for small mercies. You can see this as a lively cross-question panel this evening. If you want to get your questions in, you still have time. You can call 0345 6060 973 or text 84850. Or you can ask Alexa very politely to send a comment to LBC, followed by your question. You're listening and watching Cross Question on LBC at 8:31. The news headlines with Tim Daly. Sorry.
Donald Trump has pleaded not guilty to the charges against him concerning his criminal prosecution relating to retention of classified documents. He's done so in a Miami courtroom where he's faced 37 charges. A multiple stabbing in Nottingham city centre has left 2 students and a man in his 50s dead. Police believe the suspect killed the 19-year-olds on a street during the early hours of this morning before attacking the older man, stealing his van to drive it at members of the public. And And Boris Johnson has urged the Privileges Committee to publish its report on whether he lied to Parliament over partygate. In a statement this evening, he says, let the world judge their nonsense. LBC weather, showers passing to leave a largely dry night for most of us with a low of 10 degrees.
This is LBC. Cross Question on LBC. Text 84850.
You're listening to Cross Question on LBC. It's 8:34. I'm Ali Miraj. I'm joined by my really first-class panel this evening. George Parker, political editor of the Financial Times. George, you were brought up in Tiverton. Do you miss the countryside?
I do, up to a point, yeah. I mean, I sort of spent part of my youth on a farm in the middle of, on the edge of Exmoor, actually. And,
idyllic.
It was idyllic, a little bit difficult to get to the pub in the evening, I would say. And then I moved to London to go to university, and I must admit, I've lived up here ever since, really. So, but I do love to go back. I go back there every sort of 2 or 3 weeks, and I really love sort of going down to the moors and the coast down there.
Well, I was on Dartmoor, the single lane roads, very, very stressful to drive down. I remember very much, but great to have you here.
Well, can I just say one thing about Dartmoor is there's a brilliant book, which I think now is number 2 in the bestseller book, called The Lost Rainforests of Britain by Guy Shrubsole. If you haven't read it, absolutely brilliant book about the rainforests that we just think they're woodland, but he's said these are rainforests that need to be protected, and they grow on the side of Dartmoor.
Super. And Tony Devenish, London Assembly member for the Conservative Party. Tony, you before that were in business. Do you think it's important to have a real job if you're going to go into politics?
Oh, if I say yes, you're going to give me a whole list of people that haven't, aren't you, really?
No,
I do, really. But I also like George's answer about pubs, actually. There's more pubs in my GLA constituency than any other GLA constituency. There's a fact for you.
Well, speaking about pubs, Carolyn Harris, Labour MP and also chair of UK Menopause Taskforce, you initially were a barmaid.
Yeah, and a dinner lady.
I know that. Yeah. And was that a good training to keep order in house?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah. Order.
And Gavin, great to have you here. I was going to talk about your last book, which was about the Four Nations becoming divided.
Yes, the Four Nations, how Britain ends. I mean, the danger is still there because a number of reasons. One was people in Scotland were told in 2014 the only way to stay in the European Union is to vote to stay in the United Kingdom. Many feel betrayed. People in Northern Ireland, where I've got my roots, know that nobody really cares about them very much. And I know people in Wales, I was just saying to Caroline before we came on, Mark Drakeford has actually said, I think we've got an English nationalist government. Now, he does not ramp up the rhetoric. So those problems, it seemed to me, still exist. But they've been subsumed in other problems.
Well, other problems have taken over. Indeed, there's still time to get your questions into our panel. So if you want to put a question to the panel, you can call 0345 6060 973 or text 84850 or ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. Our next question is a text question from Nikki in Taunton, not far from that. We were talking about Devon. Are abortion laws too strict? Now, let me give you the background to this. A 44-year-old mother of 3 obtained pills to induce an abortion during lockdown when she was between 32 and 34 weeks pregnant. The legal limit is 24 weeks for any abortion and 10 weeks for using tablets. MPs, including the chair of the Equalities Committee, the Conservative chair, Carolyn, has called for reforms to the law to prosecute her, which was passed in 1861. She's been jailed for more than 2 years, and some of that time she will be spending in prison. So this is a very, very interesting and live topic. Gavin?
Well, what can one say? I think a number of things here. We have to have laws about abortion, but abortion should be legal, it should be safe, it should be available, and I hope it should be fairly rare. That's what I think as a bloke. I have talked to, I made quite a while ago a documentary about abortion, talked to a number of women, and there is nobody who goes into this lightly.
Of course.
So I feel very, very sorry for this woman. I do think the law is apparently the law, but then there's something wrong with the law. I don't know her precise circumstances, but it seems to me from this distance that this is a person who needs counselling, needs care, was quite possibly depressed or otherwise, in a really, really bad state. Otherwise, this wouldn't have happened. So I don't know whether we require a law change or whether the judge, whether on appeal somebody should overturn the jail sentence. That seems to me odd. Why are we putting someone in this case in jail? It seems a waste of everything and a problem for her. And what are jails for? They're to keep the rest of us safe. She's not going to she's not going to be going out committing other crimes. Seems to me wrong.
Carolyn, I mean, ultimately in this particular case, and we weren't in the court, we don't know exactly, but we understand that she did get these tablets. It was beyond the 10-week limit. I'm not sure what role COVID played, but she did engage in this act, initially denied it, then pleaded guilty. What do you make of the case? Do you think we need a law change?
I definitely think we need a law change, but I think we also need to think about why she did what she did. There are some women who end up pregnant for no fault of their own, and it's not just because they got involved in consensual sex. There could be any kind of backstory there that we know nothing about. And I was in a women's prison last Friday because I visit women in prison to talk about menopause, apart from anything else. And it is not a nice place to be. And you are there to learn how not to commit the crimes that led you there. This is not a crime. This was a woman who, for whatever reason, but it would have led from desperation, decided to end the life of her baby. And as a mother who lost a child, when Martin was 8 when I lost Martin in a road accident, and I know how difficult that is. I know women have miscarriages. It's a really awful, it's something that stays with you for the rest of your life. To make the decision to do it and live with that sense of responsibility and guilt, that is far worse than any prison. It's completely inhumane to have done what they've done to her.
Do you think that, Stella Creasy's been talking about this today, do you think that there should actually be term limits at all for abortions?
I think every case has its own merits, and we need to know the background of every case, and we need to know why the individuals decided to end her pregnancy. It could be medical for the baby, it could be something that they find that it would not be a viable pregnancy. I think this blanket and law passed in 18 what? So why are we even looking at laws passed in 18 what and using them to imprison a woman? It is barbaric.
Tony?
Well, I've only read the overall details on this. She's a mum of 3. I would agree, though, with the rest of the panel on this. So there's a reason there's a free vote on these issues in the House of Commons when the laws are passed. And in local government, certainly, I've done 17 years on Westminster City Council. We are there really to protect the most vulnerable. And I am very uneasy about this, but obviously I don't know the details of this particular case.
We don't know the details, but the issue arises about the rights of the unborn child as well. So there is a 24-week limit for a reason. So presumably this is going to come back to Parliament, and these things do from time to time come back, then the conversation should be around the weekly limit, I would have thought. What do you make of it, George?
Well, I agree with everything that's been said up to now. I'm certainly much rather have the laws on abortion that we have in this country than the situation that pertains in America, for example. And but I think I don't know the circumstances of this individual case. It just sounds an absolute tragedy for all concerned. But I think relying on an 1861 Act, which leads to, theoretically to carry a life prison sentence in this kind of case, is obviously wrong. And it just seems to me that if you want to maintain consent for the abortion laws we have in this country, then having up-to-date legislation and having a proper parliamentary debate on it is a good starting point. And I wasn't even aware this law was still in the statute book. I mean, it's extraordinary. It survived the 1967 Abortion Act, which set up today's sort of framework. Interesting. OK, let's go to our next question, which is from Mark in Hitchin. Good evening, Mark.
Yes, good evening, panel. This evening, Labour has announced that it is not going to support the fatal motion in the House of Lords tonight that will stop the government bringing in new legislation to make protests a lot harder. What is the use of an opposition that can't protect our right of protest?
Tony, a lot of protests happening in London, also on the Cromwell Road the other day. People actually being taken away by the police. They're getting tougher. What do you say to Mark?
Look, I'm afraid I'm not going to be supporting this caller. The reality is we've never had, this is an unprecedented level of people coming to London. Of course they should come and protest. But XR last year particularly, it is taking police in their hundreds and their thousands away from protected Londoners to actually protest and police these protests. It's cost, I think the latest figure I saw was £45 million, literally in the last few months, just for the XR protests. It is too much. And the people, frankly, are taking the ... And the reality is, the way they are behaving in a completely professional, semi-terrorist, and I will use those words, way, and the fact that they prepare for days, weeks, months. These are very well-educated, usually terribly well-educated middle-class people, and what they are doing in putting people... So I've got constituents, older constituents, disabled constituents, working class constituents trying to get to their office in the morning or their cappuccino round, and they are having their lives not just once or twice. Of course, if it's once or twice or even for a few weeks, this is for months and months and months and months. It is ridiculous, and the new Public Order Act has my support 110%, and our police are very proportionate. I sit on the Police and Crime Committee for London, and I can tell you the new commissioner and the police, the senior police officers, they are not there to attack civil liberties, but they are there to keep Londoners safe.
Okay. George?
Well, I'm sort of instinctively on the side of the right to protest in this kind of debate, but I can see the point you're just making there, which is that you also have to defend the rights of people to go about their daily lives, and there probably has to be a balance between the right to protest legally and the right of ordinary people not to have their lives completely disrupted. I suppose, leaving aside that particular part of the argument, the caller was asking about why the Labour Party aren't backing this so-called fatal motion in the House of Lords, which is basically a mechanism by which an unelected chamber can frustrate the will of the elected chamber in the House of Commons. So which is just a constitutional point. Whether you like this bit of legislation or not, it's being enacted by an elected government in the House of Commons.
Yes.
And I think a lot of people would be quite upset if an unelected House of Lords, and we've had a big debate this week about the kind of people who end up in the House of Lords.
Yes,
thanks to Boris Johnson's honours list. People who seem to have very few qualifications at all to make laws over us. So I think I'd defend the right of the House of Commons to have its way, and I can see the point of this legislation, I regret to say.
You can. Gavin?
Look, I believe in the right of freedom of speech, but that does not mean that you can go into a cinema and shout there's a bomb here. There's a limit to freedom of speech. I believe in the right to protest, as you both do, but there's a limit to that. And it's not just sort of minor inconveniences. I know actually it works, I think in my view, it works rather badly for some of the people protesting in terms of their arguments, some of which actually I think would hold water if they went about it in another way. But I know, for instance, of busloads of children who were prevented from getting to the O2 to go to something because of a problem. So all the people that you were talking about. So there has to be a limit. Now, I don't know the details of this bill, but there does have to be a limit to protest, unfortunately.
Well, it looks like some would argue that the police were pretty cack-handed. I mean, to put it politely, were not clamping down using the existing powers they had. So the law had to change to make them to allow people to go about their business. I think that's what some people would say.
It is to balance. I mean, but look at as we saw with the safety of women at night.
Yes.
And the protests of that. The police acted in ways that I certainly wouldn't support.
Indeed.
So they went on the other side on that.
Indeed. Carolyn, just before I come to you, a bit of background here. The Green peer Baroness Jenny Jones has put forward a motion to block elements of the government's public order bill, which would allow tough crackdowns on protests, but Labour's not supporting the motion. Why?
Because we believe that everyone has the right to protest, but that protest needs to be safe, and it needs to not bring a city like London to its knees. I was in London, central London on Sunday, and there was a very, very pleasant protest just outside Parliament. It was very noisy, but it was very, very well behaved. I didn't even see any police. But when you have a situation where people are deliberately being obstructive and they're stopping people going about their everyday work, they are causing damage. We've seen works of art vandalised.
Yes.
It's not acceptable. And I am on the Home Affairs Select Committee. And when we were discussing this issue in a formal session just 2 weeks ago, and we were trying to get to the bottom of what did happen with the coronation and with what Gavin was talking about, and they decided to have a protest in the middle of the Home Affairs Select Committee. Now, you cannot stifle democracy by wearing T-shirts and bringing a committee
Do they glue themselves to the...
They just sort of started to strip off and had this... and
I didn't know things like that happened at the Select Committee.
Well, you'd be surprised. Depends how hot it is. And started to speak over us.
Right.
It's not acceptable. It's not acceptable behaviour. It makes us feel quite vulnerable. Yes. They were able to do that.
Yeah.
It makes the security feel that they've not done their job when they had done their job, because they were quite... they were sneaky is the word I used in what they done. Yeah. So I totally understand why we're doing this. Protest is fine, provided it's not going to disrupt and cause huge amounts of disruption to anyone. The way that it's going at the moment is not acceptable.
Speaking over people would never happen on Cross Question. No, never. You've still got time if you want to get a question into our panel. 0345 60 60973. You can text 84850. You can ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. You're listening to Cross Question on LBC. It's 8:49.
This is LBC. Cross Question on LBC.
It's Ali Miraj on LBC with my Cross Question panel. It's 8:51. And we've got a text question in from Timothy in Chester. An Oxford Don has told students they need to be prepared to change their minds a bit more. Why are the students of today so obsessed with cancelling people? This is Oxford's Vice-Chancellor, Professor Irene Tracy, telling the university students' newspaper that its readers need to learn to sometimes change your mind on what you feel about things, and that when she was younger, there was more ease in having debate and discussion and argument and disagreement. You just bear in mind also the recent events at Oxford relating to Kathleen Stock speaking at the Union. Tony.
Look, there's always been a intolerant small minority of students, and I used to always fight them when I was at university, who were the hard left, who were always trying to ban things. And in the 80s, they were always chucking things at Tory cabinet ministers. I think it is still a very small minority of students who are trying to ban things. And I find that most university students I meet, and they are my kids' generation, are very tolerant and very sensible. And actually, they're quite a socially, dare I say this, I'll get beaten up when I get home, but they're quite a socially conservative and sensible generation. But there's always a few extremists that try to ban people.
Is it a few extremists? I mean, if you read the Policy Exchange report that came out a little while ago, they were saying that, I think the number was about 50% of academics in the country will self-censor, particularly if they're on the centre-right or right, about their views because they feel that it will hamper their career chances.
Well, I think you're quoting the academics there. You were asking me earlier about the students, and I think most students, frankly, are more interested, as we were when we were at university, at enjoying life and getting a good degree as well. You know, although, I guess, I declare an interest, I was a Federation Conservative student person, obviously. But that's the reality is most people are not that political at university, I find. But yes, there's always been a bit of self-censorship of the centre-right. I think it goes back to, I'm old enough to remember Mrs Thatcher's second term well, and I think we've always been a bit, that's the way that the left of centre, or woke as it's now called, has always been, it's been in favour in the universities.
OK, Gavin?
I think I agree broadly with that. There's always been a fringe who are intolerant of other people and don't want to listen to other points of view. I don't quite know what they're frightened of. What is the problem? There are some speakers we wouldn't particularly want to encourage neo-Nazis to come and talk to university students and so on. But the whole idea of cancelling people always strikes me as very, very strange. I mean, there's two words I really dislike: cancel and woke. And woke is never used except as a term of abuse. It's a value-loaded term with no real meaning. It just means I don't like you. And the same about cancel, you're cancelled. Yes. And, J.K. Rowling's been cancelled for years. I don't think she's ever been more popular. So I do think that a woman academic there has got a point.
Kathleen Stock.
About listening to other people's points of view, and to do so reasonably respectfully, and to disagree as robustly as you want, but to do so without saying they have to be cancelled.
Carolyn?
Well, I spend all day, every day, listening and talking to people whose political views I don't particularly agree with, but you are respectful.
On your own side or the other side?
Jeremy Corbyn again. Both.
Right.
And if I was to have cancel everyone I don't agree with, there won't be many people left in the House of Commons. So it's about respect and respecting individuals, and it's probably immature, isn't it?
But there are lines on there as well. Those students would say, well, this is the new frontier, the new horizon, that they're fighting for rights, and things evolve and cultures change and values evolve, and this is the new frontier.
Well, I think Tony's right. I mean, we've always had generation after generation of students who put themselves out there as being the pioneers of the future. In reality, I think that we just need to be respectful of each other's opinions.
George?
Yes, I have no time for all this stuff at universities. You go to university to exchange ideas, broaden your mind,
go to the pub,
challenge yourself, go to the pub, obviously, and carry on the discussion in the pub.
It didn't happen in QMW when you were there?
No, there was lots of cancelling going on, but it was. I remember, no platform for various Tory ministers because they supported the apartheid regime. Look, there are laws in place in this country to prevent hate speech and incitement to violence. But beyond that, if it's legal, it should be allowed on the campus, and you can defeat these people with argument rather than shouting at them. I think it's pathetic, to be honest.
We're talking about cancelling. I've got to ask you, Tony, just on this issue about the London mayoral contest. I mean, what is going on with this Scully Samuel Kasumu spat? You didn't really want to comment on it much, but Mohammed Hussein's going to be giving his first broadcast media interview. He's one of the 3 shortlisted Conservative candidates for the Mayor of London tomorrow with my colleague Nick Ferrari. What do you make of the contest and where we've got to?
Look, my party democratic area officers, as we call them, i.e. 20-odd people who are the area officers across London, have decided from a shortlist, I think 7 or 8, down to 3. I know all of these people incredibly well. I'm back in Daniel Korski, who I think has got the right message. He's a real problem solver. He's upbeat, and he actually has a message of hope. And he's just come out and said that we're going to cancel, if he gets in, abolish ULEZ extension on day 1, which is the policy that even most of the Parliamentary Labour Party in London tell Sadiq Khan he's got to get rid of, because frankly it's a tax on poorer Londoners. He does nothing for air quality. But the other 2 candidates, so, again, I would say we're friends, and we will have a good grown-up contest between now and the 19th of July. And the London Party members, I just get 1 vote, and that 1 vote will be going to Daniel, and people across the London Conservative parties will be voting for the candidate.
I'm very disappointed not to see you standing, Tony. That's all I can say.
I will pay you later, but I love being a part of a team, and Daniel's going to run the team if I have my way.
Right, well, the Conservative candidate will be announced on the 19th of July. Daniel Korski, Susan Hall and barrister Mohammed Hussein are going to be going head-to-head to secure that nomination. So let me come to the point in the evening where everyone quakes in their boots. Yes, it's the fun question from Shannon in Blackpool. A celebrity has posed naked for the latest issue of Vogue magazine. 82-year-old Miriam Margolis. Panel, what is the most delightfully outrageous thing you've done in your middle ages? Not that any of you are in your middle ages, but anyway. Carolyn, let me start with you.
Well, I was very radical. I stopped dyeing my hair grey, and I allowed my natural blonde, turquoise and purple to come through.
Fantastic. Gavin?
I was born in a working-class family in Glasgow, so I've never done anything outrageous. But delightful, yes, I can say delightful. My delightful thing was a while ago, I walked in the empty quarter of the desert in Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates and so on, and that was absolutely
very diplomatic. George?
We were going to say running through wheat fields, weren't we?
Some Prime Minister.
Yeah, Theresa May.
I think probably the thing that people regard as a bit inappropriate. I took my teenage kids to Glastonbury a couple of years ago and ended up leading out to the Arcadia zone with a giant spider late at night, carrying on the party. So that was probably, that's probably quite all right, wasn't it?
Oh,
it's not too outrageous.
Sounds good. Yeah. Tony?
The one thing I've got right in politics, this came from, I will say thank you to him without naming him, a former number 10 advisor, when he said, "You are boring," to a Dogs for Devenish Instagram page. And I did it so well. It was the only thing my kids ever noticed I've done. And I've now just bought a Spaniel pup. And if I can't be loved because I'm in politics, at least people love my dog.
Fantastic. Brilliant panel. Thank you to my cross-question panel this evening. George Parker, Tony Devenish, Carolyn Harris and Gavin Esler. What a fantastic panel that was. Now, a woman has been jailed for 28 months for illegally aborting her baby during lockdown. We were talking about that just now, in a controversial legal case that many fear could have wide-ranging ramifications for abortion rights in the UK. A law dating back to the 1860s was used to prosecute the mother in question, who had earlier admitted to taking abortion pills beyond the legal time limit of 10 weeks. Senior MPs on both sides of the chamber are now calling for a change to the law. 150-year-old laws that directly affect a woman's agency over her body, are they still fit for purpose? Do we need to change the way abortion is perceived in this country? How do we break the stigma around it? Are our abortion laws fit for purpose? 0345 6060 973.